Our pantry was a disaster. So I spent the last few weeks transforming it from builder grade chaos to pantry paradise. And in this video, I'm going to share the detailed steps of that process from planning to building and organizing, and then break down everything with a cost comparison at the end. Let's get to work.
There was a small amount of demo to cut and remove the baseboards. Then I built a basic frame for the cabinets using 2x4s. I ordered a bunch of pre-finished plywood so that the insides of the cabinets would all be nice and slick without that extra work, and I could just paint the outsides. But it took an extra week to get here. But in the meantime, I used an older piece of plywood to build a single drawer base, since no one would ever see the inside of that cabinet. I ripped the front and back spreaders on the table saw and prepped for assembly. I decided to do frameless cabinets for this build, mainly because I've never built a frameless cabinet before and wanted to give it a try. And to keep everything nice and tidy looking, I used pre-glued edge banding on all the forward-facing edges. I've only done a very small amount of edge banding at this point, and there may be a much better way to go about it, but with an old clothes iron, a $15 trimmer, and an X-Acto knife, I think these turned out pretty good. And with my very first frameless cabinet assembled successfully, I felt comfortable moving forward with the rest of the project. If you've seen one cabinet being built, you've pretty much seen them all. So now I'm going to focus just on the 4 unique pieces that really set this build apart, starting with the liquor cabinet. The base cabinets and this tower of power are all 24 inches deep, so ripping them was really straightforward and repeatable with the Craig rip cut jig. I used the table saw to cut a groove 3/4 inches from the back of each piece of the shell that we'll use later to slide the backing into. Even though I used screws straight into the side of the drawer base earlier, for all the rest of the cabinets I used pocket holes to hide them all together. When I lined up the bottom to start assembly, it didn't match up. So I thought I got the measurements wrong and cut another, only to find out I just turned both of them the wrong direction.
It's supposed to be that way. Idiot.
That little mistake cost me another sheet of plywood. But I finally got it assembled. I also tried installing the edge banding after cabinet assembly, and it worked fine, maybe even a little easier. All that was left was to drill the holes for the adjustable shelving. I used a shelf pin jig to drill those, then dropped in the backing piece of 1/4 inch pre-finished plywood to finish off this shell. There's not really anything special about the assembly of this cutting board cabinet so much as its purpose. Besides being a convenient place to store our cutting and charcuterie boards, my primary goal with this piece was just to break up the cabinets in the tower. So instead of 2 abnormally large, odd-shaped cabinets, the top one would be a little more normal sized. Corner cabinets are the worst. If you put two cabinets opposite of each other, you lose all that dead space in the corner. And I've never seen a Lazy Susan setup that didn't fail at some point. And even when they work, items almost never fall off the front, only the back, lost to the void or requiring that you empty the whole cabinet to fish them out. So after much deliberation, I decided that the best possible solution for this area was open wraparound shelving. Since I'm painting this whole thing, I didn't have to use the fancy plywood, which recouped the sheet I lost earlier. I cut out two 3-foot by 3-foot squares with a 1-foot by 1-foot corner taken out of each one, leaving a 17-inch opening for access.
Before I get too much further in this build, I wanted to take a minute to make sure everything fit and was lining up like I expected. And since I also needed to get all these cabinets out of the workshop to make room for the final boss cabinet, it was time to do some quick installs.
What I found was that the whole room wasn't exactly square. So getting all the other cabinets to fit and line up meant I needed to take a little bit off the outer edges of this corner shelf. So I took it back over to the workshop to get that fixed. Then, rather than crawl around on the floor later when it's painting time, I used this last opportunity to throw a couple coats of paint on it while it was on the bench. I called this the final boss cabinet earlier, mainly because of the anxiety I carried into making it. And I fully expected this to be a whole trial and error process, mostly error. But I think that extra time I spent modeling it in Fusion really paid off during the build. You might notice that its shape is similar to the iconic Superman logo. I chose this shape specifically to maximize the storage area in the cabinet while also providing stable, flat sides for the shelves that will eventually attach to it. Because of the expected weight of the cabinet and its contents, it needed to have numerous attachment points to the wall. So I chose to make the whole thing out of solid plywood held together with screws, glue, and dominoes. The whole time I was drilling these dominoes, I was thinking to myself, there's no way this is all going to line up. 0% chance this is going to work. So imagine my surprise as things started to come together perfectly. The next day, I attached a temporary brace, and one of my friends helped me lift the last cabinet into place. The last steps before moving on to the really exciting bits were to finish up the shelves and drawers. I cut out a whole bunch of shelves from the remaining plywood and added edge banding to the front of each one. I used some rubber-coated shelf pins, and that should help prevent the shelves from moving around too much. It was so exciting to really start to see how much more storage we were going to have from this upgrade. For the drawers, I was able to use cutoffs from the rest of the cabinet. I left the sides really tall like this so I can add floating drawers inside later to store smaller loose items. We decided to go with Shiplap for the walls, primarily because it would take about a quarter of the time to install as subway tile. And if I'm honest, I'm not really a fan of subway tile anyway. This was my first time installing Shiplap, but it went really smoothly and turned out looking great. I've made a lot of cabinet doors at this point, but none like the one I'm about to attempt. For the rest, I used a reversible rail and style shaper bit to cut down all the door frames and then cut the centers from 1/4-inch plywood. I always like to mention that you don't have to have a fancy shaper for this process. A router table with a nice bit, or even the table saw will do just fine.
This last glue up is going to be a little interesting because I've got something fun in mind. As you can see, I've cut this extra spreader, and instead of using 1/4-inch plywood, I want to use metal in there, expanded metal, so you can see through into this cabinet. And you'll see why here in just a little bit. And this is the metal I'm going to use. It's a nice clover pattern. Thought it would be classy, although I don't like the color, so I'm going to paint it. But, bonus, I thought I had to buy 2 pieces of this, but it turns out I can cut it in half and it's going to work perfectly, and that saves me about 50 bucks, which is great. So, well, it saves me 50 bucks if I don't screw this up. Just highlight.
I sprayed the metal down with 2 coats each of gold for the front and gloss black for the back. This assembly would have gone a lot easier if I'd used a thinner center channel. But I'm working with what I've got, and I had the idea to add the same stuff they use to tension screen porches, along with some 18 gauge staples to keep everything tight. This worked out pretty good and isn't really noticeable in the finished piece, but it did cause a blowout on one of the corners. But I was able to fix that with some super glue and a little wood putty. I cleaned up some dents and inconsistencies with wood putty and then gave all the doors a good sanding with 80, 120, and 220 grit sandpaper. Then I whipped out my trusty caulk to finish these doors off. Painting is probably my least favorite part of any project, but wow, did this look great. The color is called Raven because, as an Instagram friend pointed out, you gotta pick the color with the cool name. Hanging and adjusting the doors was pretty painless as well. I didn't even have to rebuild any doors this time. And this was the part of the project for me when you can really start to see it coming together. It was looking so good. I did end up having to add a face frame to that top corner shelf because normal hinges wouldn't work against a 45-degree angle. But it actually ended up being a pretty cool little detail anyways. My local lumberyard had this wide stock poplar that was just a little over 1 inch thick. The plan is to cut these down, clean them up, and stain them the same color as the countertop. I squared up the first side with the AccuCut XL. Then I ran it through the table saw to get 12-inch wide square lumber. Then I used the planer to get everything clean and consistent. For the shelf brackets, I didn't want there to be any visible screws. So I cut everything out of 1x4, rounded off the fronts, and drilled recessed holes with a Forstner bit that we'll fill later with plugs. With a quick test of the brackets and shelves, I was ready to get started on the countertop. If you remember me pointing out that red straight edge earlier, you'll notice here that I don't use it for some reason. You're about to find out why that was a bad idea. With that much distance between the two clamps, the center is still very flexible. Flexible enough that my saw goes under it during the cut, making this completely worthless and nearly causing me to have to buy another countertop. Thankfully, I left myself a little wiggle room and was able to take another 1/8 inch off to get it straightened out. Or so I thought. I ended up having to rip all this apart and hand plane the two surfaces to get a closer match. But between that and these clamps and a bunch of screws drilled in from the bottom, I got it pretty dang close, but not as close as I would have liked. I'm still not exactly sure what I did wrong, but I did see that the manufacturer of these tops recommends against doing 45-degree joinery, so I suspect this has something to do with it. but it's entirely possible I found a new way to screw it up too. I applied a Minwax pre-stain treatment, which I highly recommend, on all the shelves and the countertop. Then I applied a red chestnut stain and gave everything a day to soak in. I probably should have waited for help on this too, because it was no small feat to maneuver into place by myself. I cut out about 3 minutes of grunting and cussing before I finally just settled on kick it till it falls into place.
Woo.
This board has the dual role of framing in this side with the darker color, but also providing a sturdy board to screw those shelf supports into rather than just a drywall. And since I pre-drilled all the holes with Forstner bits, I was able to cut 1/2-inch plugs to hide all the screws. I put 3 coats of General Finishes High Performance on both the countertop and the shelves.
And that's how we went from this to this. But before we do the final walkthrough, I promised you a price breakdown. As I mentioned earlier, if you bought all those same shelves and brackets right now at the big box store, it's going to cost you around $750. Everything in the new pantry, materials only, cost just under $2,000 at $1,913. Now take a look at these final shots.